African heads of state closing the two-day extraordinary summit in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea. They discussed efforts to fight a growing extremist threat and push back against a recent run of military coups on the continent.
The summit on terrorism and unconstitutional change was organized by the African Union and hosted in Malabo, the capital of Equatorial Guinea. African leaders pointed out that terrorism, bad governance, and coup d'etat could have cordial links and aggravate the humanitarian crisis that plagued the continent. The leaders called for African forces to combat the terror threat facing the continent and so reduce any dependency on forces from other continents. Africa has seen recent coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, and military rule in Chad. Representatives from Mali, Sudan, Guinea, and Burkina Faso were excluded from the summit. The military has overthrown civilian governance in these countries over the past 2 years. The African Union has suspended them from its proceedings and imposed sanctions in line with other Africans and international organizations and Western capitals. According to the African Union, a host of terror groups operates across many countries, including the ISIS group, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram.
For analysis on the summit, we're joined now by Professor Hermann Ndofor from the Indiana University Kelley School of Business. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So, a timely summit, an apt one, but is the African Union up to the task? I mean, as we speak now, we can get into it at a later stage. You have a long-running conflict that has seen rising tensions between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we know that the Great Lakes region has known no peace, while there have been attempts to overthrow governments there. But this in itself cannot be good news for a regional body that's saying it's trying to bring an end to these unlawful takeovers of power and territory and the existence of mercenaries.
Certainly. First, I think that we have to appreciate the fact that they recognize the problem, talking about it, and meeting to discuss ways to tackle the problem. Although I fear, was this from their own initiative, or maybe the EU is getting more and more concerned about more refugees from Africa crossing their border? Maybe this was an EU agenda item, but it is a problem in Africa. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, most of our humanitarian crises and conflicts are predicated on bad governance. And the key suspects are the people meeting to come up with a solution, right? Whether it's coup d'etats, whether it's wars, conflict, or in the case also inadequate preparation for climate change, it boils down to bad governance.
I mean, you mentioned a very interesting point. You talk about the possibility of this being an EU agenda, and just looking at the communique, as I mentioned, one of the things that they're saying is that they need to stem the influx of foreign terrorist fighters and private military companies. There's been a lot of talk of Russian military forces in certain parts of the continent, but we know that it's not just. We've seen in the Sahel region the pushback with France, but we know that in the past there's also been talks of French mercenaries in certain parts of Africa as well. So how is Africa going to deal with this particular phenomenon, given the fact that there will be the accusation of biting the hand that feeds you?
Well, if you are afraid of that accusation, then maybe you should try feeding yourself. Right, Africa as itself has the largest arable land. Africa should not be looking for handouts and definitely shouldn't be subservient to the EU or to China. And it tells, when you look at the African Union, the largest funding from the African Union itself comes from outside continents, right? The EU and China provide the largest chunk of the funding. So the EU can start by self-funding. Let the African countries, the African heads of state themselves are wealthy enough, the ones that have been in power long enough, to sponsor the African Union. When we talk about fighters coming from other continents, that is really a pertinent point. But to stop that, the African Union, has to take up its policing function seriously. We have conflicts raging around the continent. Just 30 kilometers from where they are meeting in Malabo is Boya, where Cameroon has the southern Cameroon, eastern Cameroon conflict has been going on. These leaders could take a 30-mile boat trip there for a field trip, and they would see what the Norwegian refugee crisis has referred to as the most neglected humanitarian crisis on earth. They could see for themselves what's going on. They have not mentioned a word about that conflict. They could intervene. If the African Union is more forceful, takes a more proactive role in policing the continent, you will not need to have French troops. And by the way, foreign troops also includes French troops, right? We don't want the Wagner Group and Russian troops, but half of the heads of state who signed that statement have French troops in their country. They also have Israeli troops in their country, or trainers, not troops, but trainers in their country. So it goes both ways, but the onus is up to them to take up the security function. We talked about the Rwanda DRC crisis. That one is brewing, but yet the EU has not stepped up mediation efforts. South Africa could really play a good role in that to learn. Nigeria could play another role. The powerhouses of the continents could all step forward and try to stem these conflicts before they escalate.
I mean, if the African Union is to have a sober assessment of its response mechanisms, what would you say are its strengths and weaknesses? And as you've mentioned, some of the countries which have experience in some of these peacekeeping efforts, I mean, we've spoken about the SANDF from South Africa, which has been present in the Democratic Republic of Congo for a very long time. We've mentioned their presence in Mozambique, but just looking at the African Union, its successes, there's AMISOL, there's ATMIS, which has now morphed into ATMIS. It certainly does require a proper assessment of where the strengths and weaknesses are if we're going to talk about an African response team, peacekeeping team that is best capable of dealing with its own solutions militarily.
Yes. The strengths, I will get there because, I really need to pull whatever little hair I have to find some. But the weaknesses are staring us in the face, right? The same leaders, and they look after their own. If you look at where there is conflict, you will find that there is either a long-standing government, you have bad governance, they are highly correlated, but these leaders never want to police their own. We can talk about coup d'etats, but the number one driver of coup d'etats are governments that don't transition power. And so the only way you take them out of power is by force. The African Union could also sanction, leaders who violate their term mandate. A lot of that happens, and those are some of the root causes. But when we look, and I'll go step away from the African Union per se and look at Africa, so the strength is still in the youth. The education, numbers, and the innovativeness of the youth. Right, and that would include the fighters, those who have joined the military. And it just takes some better direction and some better governance for them to really be better able to police each other. We've seen in the Sahel, and it's moving throughout Africa, there is a level of Pan-Africanism growing. And that would not be too difficult for a well-functioning African Union to translate that to peacekeeping troops willing to cross borders to help neighbors become stable, to help neighbors prevent conflict. Right? But to build on that goodwill, to build on that energy, to build on the vibrance of the African youth, once again, you need a more vibrant African Union. So the potential is there, but it is hard to say that that potential is really being realized as a strength right now.
So what you're saying is that you need a multi-layered, multifaceted approach. And I want to know from the various conventions that the African Union itself has signed, are they in existence? I mean, you have from 2002 the Action on the Prevention of Combating Terrorism. There is the OAU Convention on Combating Terrorism. That was in 2004. And then again, you have the Johannesburg Declaration on the Initiative to Silence the Guns and the AU Roadmap on practical measures to silence the guns. So with all of these conventions, there is no doubt that there is a recognition that with 70% of the population in Africa being the youth, that is what you have to focus on.
Yes, I think there is no question. That recognition is there. We can see in the treaties. The will is the problem. Do they have the will to implement all these treaties? And that is what we have to find out. I still haven't really seen the full text. I don't think it's out yet of the meetings yesterday in Malabo. I don't think the declaration is fully been released. But it will be interesting to see what exactly they say the actionable steps will be, and to see whether or not they can hold themselves accountable to fulfilling the mandates from those actionable steps. What to do is always clear. It's whether or not the will to do it within the African Union and its current incumbent heads of state. That is where the problem usually lies.
But I mean, the figures are shocking, just looking at them. And you're right, the text is not yet out. What I'm looking at is some of the conversations from the communiques that they have released, and that includes the fact that the number of deaths and terrorist attacks have increased something in the region of 400% and 237% respectively. So we know that the biggest casualties of this are women and children, especially women and the girl child who have been used as, as slaves of war, either through acts of rape or being, dispossessed and run off from communities. The boy child who's been forced into acts of war by being made child soldiers. So beyond policing that, what can you do to end the actual conflicts? Because we know that within that is the battle for resources on the continent. So we often say it's the European countries that are stealing the wealth from African, but it is the people themselves that are stealing from the impoverished.
Yes, and you have to solve the root cause. And if you go, most of these conflicts come down to self-determination as to who your leaders are, self-determination as to how to manage your resources, your local resources, self-determination as to being able to determine your economic destiny. And most of Africa, we look in the Central African region in Malabo where it is holding. You look at Equatorial Guinea, you look at Gabon. I mean, we can go back to Cameroon. Cameroon itself is in an all-out war just on the issue of self-determination, both for governance and management of resources. Without self-determination, people are always going to rise up, right? And you have to give, and the governments have to be willing to do that. And that ties to the whole idea of good governance. Good governance gives the power back to the people to determine who their leaders are, to determine how to manage their resources. But one thing we should note, and this is an aside, is we should also note the roles of other African governments in fostering conflicts. And sometimes the word terrorism is a little bit innocuous. We know it when we see it, but sometimes the states themselves would have what we call state-sponsored terrorism. If we look in the case of the Sahel, lots of the movements there, if you look at the case going back to Cameroon that I know a little bit more about, the government itself is moving a lot of what ex or current Boko Haram fighters to the northern and southern zones of Cameroon to use as proxy fighters. And that is now taking a problem that was in the Sahel and bringing it sooner or later to plant itself in Central Africa. And before long, we will be talking about Boko Haram in Central Africa, and we'll be asking that how did they get there? They were fostered by a government trying to solve a problem they could solve on the negotiating table by using proxy fighters, right? And when you use proxy fighters across borders from other countries, that becomes essentially terrorism. And that's where you find some of these movements. So the heads of state themselves are not lacking in blame for what we find as terrorism within the continent, outside of their own bad governance, but some direct involvement in the movement of fighters across borders.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us. That is Professor Hermann Ndofor from the Indiana University Kelley School of Business, speaking to us about the outcome of that conference in Malabo, because, as he said, the full communique has not been put out as yet. We will